Gore, you said that your life has paralleled the history of the movies. In what way have you been influenced by films?
I suppose everybody's been influenced by films. I started out with books, so I had a slight prehistory of the movies. But I was born in 1925, and talkies came in, about 24, 5, 6, in and around there. I saw some silent films as a small child, which I don't particularly remember. And so I was there with the early talkies, and I watched the talkies develop and color come in. And I was the magic age of 14 in the greatest year in the history of Hollywood, which was 1939. And that was everything from Gone with the Wind to The Wizard of Oz, all the great movies. Suddenly it was a miraculous year. I saw every one at the time that it opened. So I kept tracking movies while constantly reading. Those who say, I don't know how it's going to affect later generations. After all, I knew how to read before I went to movies, but I got on a Shakespeare kick when I was 10 years old and saw Midsummer Night's Dream in the Reinhardt version made by MGM, starring Mickey Rooney as Puck. And Mickey Rooney promptly became my role model. And I wanted more than anything on earth to be not just a movie star, but to be Mickey Rooney, a child movie star. He posed as being 10 years old, and I fell for that studio guff. He was actually an old man of 14, which rather spoiled the illusion when I found out that he really was old. But he was superb in it, and I immediately began to read Midsummer Night's Dream, the text. And they were in these little funny green volumes with a very shiny cover, each of Shakespeare's plays. And they were all in my grandfather's attic in Rock Creek Park. So I just went straight through. By the time I was 17, I think I'd read all of Shakespeare, at least once. And now there's a cause of movies triggering you to read. Now, presumably you have to know how to read, so somebody must have taught you, which often doesn't happen now. 2, you must have come from a house that has books in it, which is 99.9% American houses are bookless. But if all these things coincide at once, the movies were a great trigger to reading. I wanted to be an archaeologist when I saw The Mummy with Boris Karloff, and I followed every Egyptian movie that they made. Eddie Cantor in Roman Scandals, where he goes back into Roman times, got me interested in Rome. Meanwhile, I was reading stories from Livy in my grandfather's library. So no matter how hokey these films were when they dealt with the past, with Rome, with Egypt, simultaneously they were an enormous trigger to the imagination to send one to reading. Had we had television in those days, or even if radio had been more interesting, let's say to me, which it wasn't, there might have been other diversions and I would have been less concentrated, but I had just movies on the one hand, which you only got to see once. So you looked at movies in those days in a way that nobody does now. It was, as I imagine somebody who listened to Homer the first time do the Iliad or the Odyssey, you're not only listening to the narrative unfold, you're learning it, because you're never going to hear this guy again. And as much as you can absorb it, you absorb it. Well, one did that with a movie that was fascinating, particularly one that took place within history, which already interested me. You'd never see it again. I mean, they didn't come back for reruns. There were no video cassettes. That was it. There was no TV late night show. It came and it went, and it was just a memory, to be revived by reading about the period. So one played off the other, one complemented the other. So I would think that an awful lot of my reading in childhood and after was triggered by the movies I saw.
Going back to Mickey Rooney, you said tell me somebody's favorite actor when he was 10, and I'll tell you who he is.
That wasn't bad, was it?
No, he was great. So, when you were 10...
It was Mickey Rooney.
Mickey Rooney. But what was it about him that captured your imagination?
Puck. He could fly. Well, I could fly, too. I took off and landed in an airplane at the age of 10, same age as I thought Mickey Rooney was, in the movies. So I was a flyer in an airplane, but he did it. I'll girdle the earth 40 times, whatever is that great speech of his. And I liked the idea of being able to fly without the nonsense of turning on the ignition. And he was magical, and that woods near Athens was a magical place. And it just appealed to me. And he had the freedom of it. Then I saw him in other movies, and he was just as good. Tennessee Williams always said that Mickey Rooney was the best movie actor that ever lived. He could do anything. That he became sort of a joke because of his various marriages and mishaps to something else again. He was a superb actor. So at least I picked a very good actor to emulate.
Well, maybe let's talk about your your movie debut as a boy airman.
Well, it was Pathé News, and Floyd Bennett, I think he was called. He had been in the First World War, and he wore a patch over one eye. He was a famous newsreel commentator. And my father got him to cover. My father was director of air commerce, and he was always trying to promote new prototypes of airplanes, particularly planes that anybody could fly. So this was the Hammond Flivver plane, it was called, and to prove that anybody, that a 10-year-old boy could fly it, he got me out, I think it was at Bowling Field one Sunday, and there is the TV crew from Pathé News, about 4 people, and he'd conned me into it. Flying an airplane was not that big a deal for me, but I wanted to be Mickey Rooney, and here was stardom. He kept saying he was a great con man, real salesman. And he said, now you want to be in the movies? You're going to be in the movies. And, of course, I immediately just dried up. I was terrified. But I barely got through my dialogue, and I took off the plane, made a terrible, very bumpy landing. Then I had to face the cameras and say, my father was prompting me with the dialogue, and I was supposed to say, it's just as easy as riding a bicycle. I said, but it is not as easy as riding a bicycle. You've got to do the ignition, you've got to switch on, you've got to move the rudders as you come in. And we got into sort of a hassle, and I'd love to find some of that film, because they finally just cut it down to my bicycle line. And then I remember months later going to the Belasco Theater, which was right off Lafayette Park in Washington, to see myself in the newsreel. And there I was, Mickey Rooney at last, and nobody paid any attention.
But it must have been thrilling for you.
No, I wanted to girdle the earth in 40 minutes.
I did? Oh, it wasn't a TV crew, it was a movie, right? They were filming.
Yeah. Pathé Newsreel. I have a copy of it downstairs.
Okay. So, what about the movie The Prince and the Pauper? What was it about that movie?
Well, I had a thing about twins. One could argue that perhaps it was genetic. My grandmother, my favorite parent or grandparent, was born a twin, but lost her twin at birth. So I always felt that she needed something to complement herself, proof that she at a very early age, marries a blind man who was obviously rising in the world, though everybody warned her, you're going to end up on a street corner begging, you know. But she ended up as the wife of a very powerful senator, and so she felt that she had turned out pretty well. But he needed her because she had to be his eyes. So it wasn't just a woman who made a lucky, good marriage. She had married somebody with a certain ability. She had one because she'd lost her twin, and he had one because he'd lost his eyes in two different accidents. Because he'd lost his eyes in two different accidents, and they complemented each other. Well, that fascinated me as a theme. And then I see the Malk twins, who starred in The Prince and the Pauper. And the one who played as the prince corresponds with me every now and then. He read Screening History, in which I discussed the effect of that movie on me. And out of the blue, he lives with his wife in California and retired. And we exchange letters every now and then. I quiz him a lot what it's like being a twin. One lives on one coast and one's on the other coast. Something goes wrong with one, the other has the same thing. Because they are identical twins, and they'll even go so far as to say, take a look at have them look at your left kidney, because I'm having a bit of a problem. And they'll find out, yes, he's about to have a bit of a problem. That they are so genetically like. Well, that fascinated me. Then I grew up with a boy in Washington who was killed in the Marines at the age of 18, and I felt as if I had lost a twin. So the whole theme of twins, plus the blackest, darkest novel in American literature, is Pudd'nhead Wilson of Mark Twain. And that's about twins, except one's black and one's white. Or one is perceived to be black because he has a drop of black blood. And born free ends up a slave, and vice versa. It's the darkest book ever written by an American, hence little known.
We'll come back to this theme and talk about Jimmy Trimble, but one of the things I thought was really interesting in terms of what you got out of the movies and how it related to your life was Henry VIII's sermon and how that reminded you of your grandfather.
Yes, it was a very wise speech to find in a popular movie about my grandfather. I remember my grandfather's line more clearly than the actor's line, but my grandfather always said, you must, in politics, treat every friend as though he might become an enemy, and every enemy as though he might become a friend. He said the second is easy to do. The first, he said, is difficult, but you learn it. And then he was very good on the subject of revenge. He said, I always said, when someone does me an injury, I turn the other cheek. And I bide my time. And one day, they put their head on the block, and I get them.
So much for the turning the other, so much for Christianity.
Yes.
Your grandfather was an enormous influence on you.
Oh, indeed he was. Indeed he was.
Can you tell us about him?
Well, I took it for granted that everybody lived in the house of a blind grandfather, you know, and what you see every day you take for granted. I used to like to go in when he was preparing himself for the day, and he'd tell me stories. I forced him to tell me stories all the time. A story about a bunch of boys who lived in a tree in Mississippi, and they lived on cornbread, and how they lived, and they scavenged around, and they had adventures. And once he had his teeth out. He had 2 plates. And finally, he loved to tell the story. I got very irritated. I said, there's too much static. Can't you put the teeth back in as you tell me this part of the story? So he dutifully put his teeth back in so I could. And static, he always listened to the radio, so I was used to static was a word that was common in our household. And I'd play with his glass eye, which he'd keep at a glass of water at night, and I'd play with his. It was sort of steel gray, which is the standard color for a Gore eye. And I'd sort of play around with it and sort of shoot marbles with it when he wasn't looking, and he was never looking. And I'd hand it back, and he would dunk it in the solution, and then he'd pop it into his socket. The other eye was real, but very cloudy. Tragedy was that he had a living optic nerve until he was in his 50s, but they didn't know how to bring his sight back. Now, of course, they could have done it immediately when he allegedly lost sight.
But he didn't allow that to keep him from...
No, he didn't. Well, he was used to it. He was 10 by the time he was totally blind. And they wanted to send him off to... a school for the blind, and he said, I'm not going. He said, I'm going to be a senator. And they said, well, how can you're going to be a lawyer or something before you can do that? And he said, I'm going to law school. So his father, who was a lawyer and was county clerk of Webster County, which is in the north central Mississippi, sent him through school with a boy cousin who had no money, but was bright, so they paid for the cousin to read to him. And that's how he got through what was the equivalent of high school. Then he went to Lebanon Law School. Cordell Hull, later Secretary of State, was in his class. And he got his law degree very early. By 25, he was running for Congress in Mississippi, practicing law with his father and his two brothers. And by the time he was 30, he was the leading lawyer of the family. It was his firm. He lost a very dirty election in Mississippi and quit the state in absolute disgust and said, I'm not coming back till I'm a United States Senator. And he'd figured out not only was it a bad race for him, he was accused of being pro-black, which in those days was fatal. But you had to wait forever. They don't turn senators out in Mississippi, as we see with Trent Lott. They keep them on and on and on. You have to wait till somebody dies, and nothing like a seat in the Senate for immortality. So he went to Corsicana, Texas, and the family, his father and brothers went with him. They practiced law. Got caught up in a shotgun wedding situation. He had made a blind girl pregnant, which is the trick of the week, a blind boy and a blind girl. Thank God nobody believed her side of the story, except his mother. So he won the suit, and she was a ward of the person who owned the boarding house where they stayed. The only person who believed the girl was my grandfather's mother, and she adopted her and took her in to her home, which was Mississippi. Then my grandfather and his father and his two brothers lit out for the Indian Territories, which my grandfather organized in about 5 years into the state of Oklahoma, and got himself elected first senator in 1907, and served till 37.
Did that woman have the child?
She did, and it died. That was a deep family secret, which I didn't discover until a few years ago, when somebody sent me court records.
That's fascinating. It seems as though your grandparents doted on you.
Well, if you've got a blind man who insists on being read to 24 hours a day, and you have a child who likes to read, who can read and likes to read aloud, they better dote on me. My grandmother couldn't go out to a tea party unless she knew I'd be there to read to him. So he and I were quite happy. He listening and me reading. And she was quite happy to escape every now and then. One of his favorite jokes would be after you were worn out and your voice was starting to go. And he'd say, you know, Milton's daughters both went blind reading to him. And he would chuckle at the thought of blind Milton's blind daughters.
How do you think he would describe you as a child?
Somebody who read well and was extremely precocious about language. As I was learning an awful lot of languages, I was learning to sound the syllables that confronted me. I mean, I was doing the congressional record. He was chairman of the banking committee and involved in a lot of sort of funny money plans, as all the Southerners were. And so I knew I was about the only 10-year-old who knew about bimetallism. And I just learned an awful lot through that. Now, he loved history and poetry. So I read a lot of poetry. We read a lot of Ingersoll and Brand, the iconoclast. These were two satiric writers, both free thinkers, which is polite for atheists. And my grandfather was an atheist, which he had to keep hidden as he was a senator from the heart of the Bible Belt. But he never lied about religion. On the other hand, he never let on, so nobody knew that Senator Gore did not believe in our little Lord Jesus. I had another atheist politician in the family on my father's side who ended up as mayor of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And officially, he was, I think, a Lutheran, and he married a Vidal, and the Vidals were Episcopalian, having given up Catholicism the second they set foot on North American soil. And they were married, and in the small town in South Dakota, or in Sioux Falls, it's a fair-sized city, said, what are you going to do about the religious thing, the differences between you? And His Honor the Mayor said, well, we've solved it. One Sunday, we don't go to my church, and the next Sunday, we don't go to her church.
How did it come to be that you spent so much time with your grandparents that you seemed to be living with them?
Well, my father quit the Army. He was an instructor in aeronautics at West Point. I was born in 25 and 26. He was bored. He was the first lieutenant. He didn't want to be a military man for his whole career. There were no wars coming up. He felt no sense of duty, really, that involved his talents, which were as a flyer and for aviation. Suddenly, new airlines were cropping up all over the country, and he wanted to get into that business. So he resigned from the Army, came with my mother to her father, Senator Gore's house in Rock Creek Park. And the senator was doing quite well. This is 1926. By 1929, he lost everything in the crash, but still had the big house in Rock Creek Park. So we camped out there pretty much for my first 10 years, during which my father founded 2 airlines. One was called TAT, which later became TWA, and another was called the Ludington Line, which did about 4 flights a day from Washington, Philadelphia, New York, and back. That later became Eastern Airlines. So my father, and then later he founded with Amelia Earhart, Northeast Airlines, which never made a penny, but ran for about 30 years. The other 2 he lost through mergers. As soon as you had an airline that was really viable, the inventor of it, the creator of it, was got rid of. And the lawyers came, and the bankers came, and then they would merge it with 2 or 3 other airlines, much the way the conglomerates are doing today with everything. And the creative person was always got rid of first, which in my father's case was himself. But he had no interest in money. And when he lost one airline, he'd go out and start another one. Anyway, I lived with the Gores until my mother married Auchincloss, and I was 10 or 11 then. And we moved across the river to Marywood. And I was lived there officially till I was about 16, and she divorced him. But I was generally away at school during those years.
What do you mean when you say that you were brought up in the house of Atreus?
Well, it was a house full of...
Can you use the phrase and then explain it?
I wrote somewhere that I often felt that I had been brought up in the house of Atreus. That was due to having Clytemnestra for a mother. And she was an alcoholic, which does not make for good temper or easy relations with anybody. And but she had enormous charm. But she was a raging, frustrated figure. And Mr. Auchincloss was a very nice but rather weak man, not up to her mettle. My father was far too dominant for her, and he wouldn't quarrel. All she wanted was quarrel. She couldn't have... I figured it out. In fact, she was very candid about her private life to me. As a kid, particularly in her cub, she couldn't really have orgasm without a fight. She had to have a ferocious fight. And then whenever she menstruated, she would go into a kind of terrible decline. And I think she had hemorrhages. She had all kinds of problems due to her sexual cycle, which were not made much better by change of life, by which time I had changed mothers, as it were, and no longer saw her. But I'm told she was just as ferocious to the end. And wherever she was, there was terrible trouble, violent scenes and rages. And she had 2 children by Auchincloss, and the daughter got knocked around a great deal by her mother. And she was sort of a savage. And that was enough for me to refer to at least that household with the unhappy name of Merrywood, who was indeed my house of Atreus.
You wrote that, well, how do you think that that environment affected your imagination?
Well, I don't know. No.
Well,
Imagination. I don't think that would affect what you suggest would be my imagination. Imagination works by itself, and I don't think it's much influenced by external events. It's an internal arrangement. What it did for me was I was very quick to understand what other people were all about, and I was very curious. And she was very articulate, even no matter how drunk she got. She expressed herself very well. She had the Gore gift of phrase. So I learned everything about her marriage, of a sexual nature, and even more important, of a financial nature. And by the time, I mean, when I got off to boarding school, properly speaking, to Exeter, say, I felt that my classmates were like little children. I thought I'd reverted to kindergarten. I knew things about the grown-up world they never even suspected. And I figured that I would have to be very cautious and diplomatic in dealing with them because their attitude seemed to me so childish and so unprepared for reality. Even though not everybody was going to have a house of Atreus in his life, enough of them would experience bad times. And I thought, these kids aren't very well prepared for life in the way that you are with a blind senator for a grandfather and a mad woman for a mother and a lot of violence going on.
When she couldn't get your father to fight with her, would she pick fights with you?
Oh, yes. Anybody. I mean, she was ecumenical. When it came to rage, it could go in any direction.
You wrote that the life of the imagination became more and more intense as the reality about me became more unendurable.
I suppose, well, certainly it had the aspect of a refuge that, you must remember, I was writing all this time. I never stopped writing from the time I was 7, 8, 9. Mostly poetry, but I was already trying prose. So it was an alternative to daily life, was writing. Was not much of an autobiographical writer, curiously enough. I never became one, really, except when I sat down to write a memoir where I obliged myself to do it. But by and large, I don't write novels that are thinly disguised versions of myself and what happened last summer.
Right. Another thing you wrote, which I think is really great, you said, as one means of escape, I had developed a vivid inner life with a number of fictional narratives going on in my head at any one time.
That's true, and that lasted.
Can you say that back to me in your words?
Hmm. Well, you do develop, if you are a natural storyteller, and you're living in a story that you don't enjoy, which was life with mother, life in the house of Atreus, you do tend to rely upon the narratives that you tell yourself. And I had always had about 4 or 5 serials going in my head with myself as central to those stories. And if things got particularly unendurable in my surroundings, then I would it would be like fuel on my inner narratives and drive them. So I was making inner narratives that were far more real to me than my surroundings were. And that obviously was a plus.
Yeah. Did you spend a lot of time alone as a child?
As much as I could, yeah. My mother belonged to the school that you should get out and play with the other boys. Well, the other boys bored me, by and large, except for Jimmy Trimble. And he was interesting because we were so like and so unlike. What I was, he was not, and what he was not, I was. And each knew that the other was a balance for him. He was the greatest athlete in the school, and I was the greatest writer in the school, because I was the only writer in the school that I know of in our class. But he knew I was doing it. It was interesting, and when I was reading some of his letters to his girlfriend from the Pacific, and he was talking about what he had been offered contracts with the Washington Senators and with the New York Giants at 17 when he graduated from Exeter. They'd send him to college, keep him out of the war, and then he would take his choice. Well, he'd just have to decide first which team he'd be with. And in one of the letters, he's looking forward to the future, and he said, "You've got to face it," he wrote this girl, that, you're going to be married to a professional athlete. And this isn't, from what I can tell, a very easy life. It's moving around. But there's no way that I'm not going to be. But he said it will end one day when the arm, he always referred to the arm because he was an extraordinary pitcher. And so the arm was going to go one day, and I think I'll be a writer. And that was the transference of me to him, that he thought, well, if he does it, I can do that. I, however, never had the arm.
How old were you when you met Jimmy Trimble? Can you tell me, do you remember meeting him?
Yes, and we were in the same class at St. Albans, so I saw him there. I didn't get to know him until he moved into the dormitory for the lower school, although I was only a 30-minute drive from the school. My mother, busy with her private life at Marywood, wanted witnesses out of the way, so I was sent to board in the school. which at first I thought was pretty dreary, and then arrives Jimmy in the dormitory. And then, of course, it was paradise. I hated going home. But he would often come back to Marywood with me. So we were, 13? The last time I saw him, we were 17. And 2 years later, he was dead.
But tell me about the first years, when you first got to know him and how your friendship developed and what you saw in him, what he saw in you.
Well, we were so uncannily different in our interests and so alike in our temperaments. I was exactly 1 week older than he. I was born the 3rd of October. He was born the 10th. And the likeness was startling. And what was the likeness? What is the likeness between a would-be poet and what is already considered the greatest athlete that Washington ever produced, schoolboy athlete? And it was that each of us, by the time we were 12 or 13, was what he was. We knew what we were. He was a great athlete, and I was going to be a writer. No, everybody else was trying to say, well, I don't know, I may go to law school, I don't know. My father's in medicine, though, and everybody's rambling around, nobody knows what to do. Schools never taught anything of interest to anybody, so you weren't going to be helped by your classes. But here were 2 boys who were already grown up, posing as 13, 14, 15-year-olds. The pose was hard to do sometimes. And I was talking to one of the teachers still surviving. Remember, we had a headmaster called Albert Hawley Lucas, canon of the Cathedral of Washington. And he was a very pompous Anglican, very high Anglican priest. He was so jealous of Trimble. Trimble's name would be in the papers at least once a week, headlines. And the Reverend Albert Hawley Lucas was never mentioned. And it was very demure, but he was constantly sabotaging Jimmy, according to this teacher, who told me about it years later, that he became very tense at the mention of the star that he had on his bailiwick.
So when did friendship turn to love?
Who knows what that means? I don't know.
But you've described him as being your other half in a platonic sense.
Yes. Well, to say another half is literally how it was conceived, how it evolved on my side. I assume on his side. I never speak for other people's emotions because you could never know them. But you certainly know what you feel, and that was indeed a fact. But the separation began. My mother decided that I had to go off to Los Alamos, a school in New Mexico. Later became the place where the atom bomb was developed. And everybody rode his own horse, that kind of thing. And it was, she would get somebody to tell her about a school. Immediately I'd be pulled out of wherever I was and put into that school. I couldn't stand that. And so I got out of there and went to Exeter, which I quite liked, for 3 years, and then graduated. In June of 43 and in July, I enlisted in the Army. And he, meanwhile, was safe. He was graduated from St. Albans. And I think he agreed to go with the Washington Senators, and they'd set him up at Duke. And he would have been safe from the war, and had an education, and had a career. After 4 years of Duke, only he became patriotic, as boys did then, and joined the Marines. And they managed to kill off a great deal of our generation through sheer boneheaded strategy.
You saw him once before that, though, right?
Yeah, in the Christmas New Year's season of 43 to 44, I guess it was. We had a final meeting.
But you had no way of knowing that that was going to be the last meeting.
No. Well, our generation was the greatest generation, as we have been dubbed by television. We were, most of us, fairly convinced that we'd probably be killed. Particularly those of us who went in at 17, which meant that you were insufficiently trained. The group that I went in with was supposed to be in a special group at VMI, to be trained to be engineers, something for which I had no talent. And I wanted languages for the Allied military government after the war, but I ended up in the engineers. Well, the Army dissolved the program, having enticed hundreds of thousands of 17-year-olds into this program. They dissolved the program and threw them straight into the infantry and to the Battle of the Bulge, in which a large percentage of my class at BMI was just slaughtered. They hadn't been sufficiently trained to survive. So the bad faith with which the Army acted toward its greatest generation, I sometimes think the greatest generation of chumps that ever lived, was brutal. But then I was brought up in Washington, and I have always known, for the first time I ever talked seriously to Senator Gore, that the American government always acts in bad faith toward everyone, particularly its own people. Once you go in knowing that, nothing surprises you.
At what point in your life did you realize that Jimmy Trimble was so singularly important to you?
No, I don't know that he was. Reviewing my life, I realized, yes, he was, but that didn't happen until I wrote Palimpsest. And the pieces start to come together, and then I realized that indeed was a major part of my life. But had I not done a review of the whole thing, I'm not somebody who sits back and thinks about memory lane. I startled somebody by saying once that there is not one moment in my life that I would like to relive. None. I move forward, and I don't go backwards.
Well, let's go back a little now, though, and talk about Exeter. You say, just now you said that you really liked it, but you've also written about how cruel it was you said that that it was a good training ground for every kind of warfare.
Oh, yes.
Wait, can you one second? Yeah.
Well, Exeter was a pretty brutal and merciless world. There are no rules, they would say proudly, until they are broken. And for just some silly infraction, you'd be on the train to Boston the next morning. They cut people out so quickly. And they did the old gleeful number as the first class assembles in chapel. Look to your left, look to your right. At least one, maybe two on either side of you will not be here by graduation. They took great pride in that. I, who had come from a much tougher world than Exeter ever dreamed of, just thought they were putting on airs. I could teach them about toughness if they really wanted to know what the great brutal world was like. So I never took them very seriously. There were attempts made to throw me out. My grades were generally terrible, and because I was bored. I had one or two good teachers, and I learned a lot from them, but never in the classroom. It was just picking their brains and talking to them, and I preferred them to the other boys, by and large. And I learned a great deal from certain two of them. And of the other boys, their like is drawn to like. The literary crowd I ran with, we put out a little magazine, and we wrote for it. And There were lots of fights over what should be included and not included. Usual stuff. But I liked it because it was large, and you could sort of have any kind of life you wanted. There's 700 of us. And that gave you a lot of freedom in a school with 70 people, which is what I was at Los Alamos. It's incestuous. Everybody's getting on your nerves, and everybody's watching. And it was kind of a rather bad family environment. Whereas Exeter was just like the real world, and if you could manage it there, you would have no trouble managing real life. In fact, I found real life rather easy after Exeter.
Tell me about the debating society.
Well, there were 3 of them.
You say 3 of what?
Now, there were 3 debating societies. I ended up president of the oldest one, called the Golden Branch. Then there was an Exeter Senate, and there was another one called Henry Soule. And I liked that because I was intending to, although I was writing all the time and publishing occasionally in the school magazine, I was headed for politics, and of course it was the great debate was going on, America First. And I was the head of America First at Exeter, and the school was 90% for intervention on the side of England. So we isolationists had a rather hard time of it there, but it meant a lot of debating, and a real debating. This is the last time the United States was ever allowed to have a debate about anything. It was over whether to get into the Second World War. And the country was split over this. And families were split. And it was an obsession with all of us. Which side were you on? And so it made a real polemicist out of me. I had signs of it already, but it really made me one. And the debating societies, of course, were one of our forums in which to engage on this debate. And curiously enough, since then, with Pearl Harbor, that was the end of that. Since Pearl Harbor, we've fought nearly 100 wars, hot, cold, tepid. Not one was ever declared. Not one was ever debated. Nothing has ever been put to the people about anything. People have just been exempted from decision-making involving themselves. Harry Truman didn't dare ask the people for a declaration of war over Korea. He had to sneak in under the United Nations banner. All the other wars, Vietnam, nobody dared until Lyndon Johnson faked the Tonkin Bay attack, which never took place, and got a sort of act of Congress out of it, of approval. I have watched in my lifetime, in my youth, I was very much involved in public affairs because of my family and my own inclination, my own interest. I don't find anybody, any adults now in America, have any interest in anything except how the NASDAQ is going and are they going to make some money out of the Dow Jones. They don't care about Kosovo. They don't care about anything. We could blow up Peking tomorrow, or Beijing as they now call it. And half the Americans would say, well, where's that again? You know, that's Afghanistan, isn't it? To watch the exclusion of the people from the democracy, as we called it, it wasn't quite one, but it was getting close, has been a tragic aspect of my life. It is so unlike what my grandfather's world.
I thought it was wonderful when you were talking, I think it was in Screening History, about, well, I guess I was just struck by how much your life, both by growing up backstage, as you talked about in Washington, as well as the trip to Europe, how much your life intersected with these really extraordinary moments of the history, the time you lived in. And maybe if we start by, if you could tell me about the growing up in Washington and how, as part of the ruling class and being brought up in that way.
Well, you learned an awful lot, and particularly I would lead my grandfather. He usually had they assigned page boys to senators with weaknesses like blindness. But often he would use me as his page, and I would lead him on the floor of the Senate, and if there's an empty chair near him, I'd sit and hear the debates and take him into the cloakroom where the real politics went on, where the senators would get together and plot. And I was very much aware that I was in the engine room of the Republic. And with Roosevelt, on the one hand, as a villain in my grandfather's eyes, even though he was a Democrat, and something of a hero in my father's eyes because he was Director of Air Commerce for Franklin Roosevelt. So I had two ongoing views of the president, one negative, one affirmative. And there he was, central to the city, central to the country, at the end, central to the world. I first saw him in March 1933 when he drove down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol after he had been inaugurated. And we had rented rooms in a hotel, Willard's Hotel, about the third or fourth floor. That's what the people did in those days to watch the parade. You would rent a suite, and then you'd all get together, and everybody got drunk. And there he was in an open car, waving his hat. It's great, a huge head, much larger than the usual head, rather pink, and very jaunty. And 4 years later, I sat with my father in the pigeon droppings of the Commerce Department outside. We got out of the window, which was my father's office as Director of Air Commerce, and he had just quit. So he was not involved in the inauguration. But we sat among the pigeon droppings with these Greek columns on either side of us. And there was FDR again, waving the hat. And he was such a presence. And one knew this was the center of the world. I've been reading some very funny stuff about the Golden Age, my last book. Why, he thinks Washington's the center of the world. And I wrote to the Times Literary Supplement in London when some fool English reviewer had said that. I said, and the Washingtonians think that they're there. I said, well, they think that they are the center of the world, and they are. And I think I'm at the center of the world as a Washingtonian, and I am. And you're not. You're on the periphery. You're part of our empire, and a not very important part of it. And I also did this with an Australian critic who was just, thought the Japanese were vicious, subhuman people who had blown us up at Pearl Harbor because they're so evil, not knowing that we had goaded them into it. President Roosevelt needed a war so that he could fight to help England against Hitler, and the only way he could do it was through the back door, to get the Japanese to attack us, which meant that the Germans would then declare war on us, etc., etc. I watched us, in the course of my lifetime, move from a great but rather enclosed isolationist power. With all the money in the world, we became the center of the world financial apparatus in 1914, when England ran out of money and the money power moved from London to New York. So we were already number one, but we were, by and large, the country was 80% isolationist, and we didn't want to go back to war in Europe again. That was the background for me being the head of America First at Exeter. So this was the grand debate. Are we to become the world empire, which we knew we could do, or do we mind our own business and try to achieve a civilization? Unfortunately, we picked empire. And so we ended up, thanks to Roosevelt, in getting us into the Japanese and the German war. We end up as victorious against both of those powers, with the rest of the world pretty much in ruins. And we alone are the number one power economically and domestically. And we neglected to create a civilization to go with it. By 1950, when Truman militarized the country, we ended up with bases everywhere on Earth and no schools for the people, no health care. So we have a great global empire with nuclear weapons and no life for 80% of the citizens. Nothing at all. They're on their own. Well, I would have reversed it. So that has been the ongoing drama of my 75 years, as I lived through it all, and I had, as you point out, the luck to have intersected with history itself, not only watching Roosevelt, also from the lawn of the White House. I went there to roll eggs on Easter. But in '39, I watched Neville Chamberlain leave Downing Street to go to Parliament to say that war is at hand. That was the 1st of September. On the 3rd of September, war was declared. On the 4th of September, I was in a ship out of Liverpool, headed across the Irish Sea, past the ruins, or the half-sunk sister ship of the ship that I was on, which had been torpedoed by the Germans, first ship to be torpedoed. Earlier that year, in '39, I watched Mussolini a couple of times in the Piazza di Venezia and also in the Terme di Caracalla, Rome. I watched Daladier, the Prime Minister of France, on the 14th of July ride through the streets of Paris, surrounded by not tanks, cavalry. I think it even went through my mind then, this is really more appropriate for a movie like Gunga Din than it is for All Quiet on the Western Front. And it proved to be closer to Gunga Din as France caved in very quickly.
Tell us about seeing Mussolini at the Casa Caracalla.
Well, I was with a bunch of schoolboys from St. Albans. We were official children. One was the son of Hamilton Fish, who was the ranking Republican member of the House Foreign Relations Committee, a great isolationist. And a couple of other official boys and 2 masters from school. And we were in a box, which meant just a railed-off place, and in the ruins of the baths of Caracalla. And then there was a stage in front of us, an orchestra, and more people back there. And Mussolini was over to our left, wearing a white uniform, very preoccupied. I've looked up what was going on that day, and he'd been receiving some very unpleasant orders from Hitler and didn't know quite how to respond to them. But he lasted for the first act, and then he got up to go down on stage and salute the audience. I was overwhelmed by the amount of perfume that he was wearing as he went by me. It was a hot August night. And I thought that was rather decadent. And the opera was Turandot, first time I ever saw that.
And then with Neville Chamberlain, the response of the crowd.
Well, Chamberlain, there were the boys from St. Albans. There were about 6 of us by then, counting the 2 masters and their wives. There was a crowd, I don't suppose more than 40 people in Downing Street, a couple of policemen. And he came out, he was a very small man with a tiny head, and looked terribly nervous. He was carrying some sort of a briefcase. And he wore one of those wing collars, and he had the stringy neck with a big Adam's apple and a beaky nose. And very furtive, he was kept looking to left and right. I suppose he thought they might be stoning him because he had promised peace in our time when he came back from Munich, and here they were, in no time at all, getting ready to declare war on Germany. And as he came out, and the car was waiting for him, somebody opens the door, and he moves very tentatively toward the door to the car. And the people standing there went, I've never heard that sound before or since. you read in novels about they sighed. Well, I don't know what a sigh is like. I've never heard a sigh in my life. People don't sigh. They cough or they burst into tears. They do make noises, but they don't sigh. This crowd sighed. Here we go again. Well, as war clouds gathered, suddenly my mother got active. And she went to, I think, Cordell Hull, or maybe Sumner Wells, whoever, Secretary of State. She didn't bother with clerks ever. She would go to the top. And she said, my child is over there now with young Hamilton Fish and some other boys from St. Albans, and we've got to find a way to get them out of there. They're in Italy. And immediately the embassy was alerted, Ambassador William Phillips. And they got us on what was the last train before they shut the border between Italy and France. And I found it very exciting. It was like a movie, but I'd seen a lot better movies in my day than this one that I was in. You know, it was just, you packed quickly, you got on a hot train, there was no air conditioning in those days. And we got to the border, and that was the first time I had really noticed fascism. You saw guys running around in black shirts and so on in Rome, but they certainly stayed out of the way of the tourists. And it wasn't any great bother. And then, of course, you could see Mussolini on his balcony haranguing the people. Not as funny as Jack Oakey was in Chaplin's movie, The Great Dictator. So I felt that I was in an inferior movie, the Second World War, to be frank. I'd seen a lot better pictures. But it did get interesting and a little bit scary as we approached Ventimiglia, I suppose it was, up near the border, when the black shirts, the fascist police, came through to look at our passports. American passports, for those interested in trivia, were maroon-colored back in 1939. And we produced our passports, and they pretended to stare at them and scowl and carry on. But luckily, I think Hammy had a diplomatic one, which had a gold line around it. And I had something or other written in mine to say that I was an official child. So we were let through without any problem. Whether others were stopped, I don't know. I was not in that movie. That was a different one. Then, I was taken aback, to say the least, where I realized that I might well be in a first-rate movie. It was after leaving Liverpool on the Antonia, was the ship. We had been told that the Athenia, the sister ship, had been sunk either that day or the previous day. Not many lives lost, but some, and it hadn't totally sunk, and there were still boats going out to pick up survivors. And we were out there in the Irish Sea, sort of off to starboard of this half-sunk ship. And there were these frightened-looking tourists getting into rowboats, really, I guess, and being rowed to shore. And I thought, well, this is promising. This is promising. And we did think a bit about being, because they'd been torpedoed, and it was expected that we probably would be too. So the captain did a zigzag across the North Atlantic. I mean, we ended up in Greenland, we ended up in Iceland, we ended up in Newfoundland. We came in finally through Canadian waters. I forget what it's called, back of Newfoundland, but there's a whole sort of estuary. And so we didn't go down the coast because U-boats were around. We went inland. And tragically, the ship had run out of chocolate. which caused consternation to the boys from St. Albans. In fact, they ran out of everything. And we were finally allowed to drink grenadine. They thought that would be the least painful for our boyish stomachs. Well, some of us got hold of harder stuff than that. So in a slight alcoholic daze, we arrived in Freedom's Land after crossing the Atlantic in wartime. And my hair, I was bright blonde when I was a boy, was dark brown when I arrived. It's amazed everybody, but boys' hair do change during adolescence. But I was sent off to the barber's. It was quite long. And I'll never forget the astonishment of the barber, because being an all-American boy, aside from standing briefly under a shower, I'd never think to wash my hair. You've never seen so much darkness come out of my hair, and I rose from the basin, a golden blonde again. That was my war in the Atlantic.
One thing that you said that I liked about that incident was that you couldn't imagine yourself a real-life victim, since your true life was that of spectator at the drama of others, and that your empathy aroused only by their fictional sufferings.
Yes, I think there was something in that I certainly didn't think I was going to be a victim on that trip. I mean, this was for me to judge as a movie, and the train ride wasn't that good. The boat ride started out like a pretty good picture, but it ended with me in the basement of the Mayflower Hotel having my hair washed, which is not very dramatic. I didn't identify with these events, but I was fascinated by them. As a constant reader and also moviegoer would be fascinated by. However, by the time that I enlisted in the Army, I was quite aware that I was now the hero of what could be a fatal movie, and I became thoughtful.
You mentioned the word empathy. You've said that. In what way did you develop the sense of empathy through the movies?
Well, I think you do it through reading as well. I think more through reading. You have a longer time to dwell on an incident. The movies just rush by, and maybe you get caught up in it, and maybe you don't. You can reread and reread and recreate. I think empathy is more apt to come out of literature than it is apt to come off the screen.
Oh, but let's jump back to Rome for a minute. Let's not go back to the unwashed hair. And your first, what was your first impression of Rome?
Oh, it was a dream come true. That was, everything in my life had prepared me for Rome. All my reading, quite a few movies had been placed there. Last Days of Pompeii, I'd been very impressed by that. I felt I was home, and I just couldn't get enough of it. And I would stay behind, and everybody would go off back. We stayed at the Hotel Flora, and I would always find some excuse not to go back, which drove the masters crazy, because they were always fearful they'd lose one of us. And I'd stay on in the Forum, which in those days was not as cleaned up as it is now. It was full of bushes, weeds, I picked up the most beautiful Roman head, about that big, perfectly carved, obviously broken off of a bas-relief. And I'm afraid I hid it in my pocket, and of course one of the masters saw it and made me put it back. I said, well, it's just lying there. If I don't take it, somebody else will take it. He said, yes, but you're not supposed to take it. So I've thought about that head for 50 years, you know. That was mine. And why I let him take it away, I don't know. But the whole city was just magical for me, and I knew a lot about the classical period. I didn't know anything about the Renaissance period, but saw obviously the beauty of it, you know, the palaces and so on. I didn't really learn that until the 1960s when I moved there to write Julian and Creation. Then I got captured by the Renaissance and by Borromini and company.
But standing in the forum, you had read so many stories, and could you imagine what it would have looked like?
Oh, sure. And I read the guidebooks very carefully. Baedeker is what we used in those days, and I was amazed at how small the rostrum was where they got up to make speeches. Originally, it was right in front of the Senate. You came out of the Senate, and there were steps going down to the ground level of the forum. But you could also go out and step on a platform which ran pretty much the length of the steps of the Curia, as the Senate is called. And you go out there, and there'd be a crowd, not much of one, because it was so crowded with statues and buildings. You think of Mark Antony addressing thousands. Well, it must have been hundreds, because there wasn't any room in there. Everything was built up. And then it had been moved off to the side near the arch of Septimius Severus, where it now is. So you'd go up there and visualize what it must have been like when Caesar was murdered. Caesar was actually murdered over in Trastevere. Not in Trastevere, near the Campo di Fiori. There's a glove shop, which was built where the vestibule of the theater of Pompey was. And they found pretty much the exact spot where Caesar was stabbed. So if you want to buy a pair of gloves, you can go and see where Julius Caesar met his end. Because they were repairing the Senate that day, the Senate building, and so the Senate met in the theater of Pompey. But I was filled with all that even at 13, 14. So I was home.
And then you made it your home.
And I made it my home years later. One could argue that as my other home real home was Washington, D.C., which was busy imitating Rome, I always felt that it just didn't quite cut the mustard, you know. And it seemed like Disneyland before there was a Disneyland. My grandfather he hated all public spending. Nothing, in the 30s, all those Greek temples, the archives building, the Supreme Court building, all of those were going up. And I watched them go up, and he and I used to take walks. And I'd have to describe for what are they doing over there? Well, they got 6 columns, and there's a big bronze door. And he'd always sigh and say, oh, they'll make the most wonderful ruins. He saw Washington, D.C. as just another Rome shattered to pieces. Little did he know that we would bring it on ourselves. I am now seized by the mantle of prophecy.
Would you like to break for lunch now, or do you want to keep going a bit?
Well, a bit. What time is it?
It's 1:15.
Well, 5 minutes.
Okay. I don't want to... okay. The other thing that I loved reading about was, and you touched on this, but about talking about growing up in Washington as being like backstage politically, and how you used a wonderful example about Henry Long at your family table rehearsing, and then later seeing, and that it was a calculated performance. If you could tell us that, and how that would have contributed perhaps to your knowledge that it is not what things are that matters so much as how they are perceived.
Well, the showbiz aspect of the senators in my youth were great national figures. Movie stars were very, very big in those days, and college athletes were very big. My father had been one of those. And then there was the Senate, so there were sort of three orders of celebrity in the land. The senators gave very good value, and they were wonderful actors, and each had his own act. No two were really alike. And the best of all was Huey Long from Louisiana, and he and my grandfather were great friends. And he'd come to the house, and he would just start talking, and you couldn't stop him, man. He would just be talking about, I got to tell you this, and this is my vision. I want you to hear my vision for America. And I'm going to say to that son of a bitch Roosevelt, I'm going to get his head. And he would be doing this at the breakfast table at the Gores, and my grandfather adored listening to him, and I was just fascinated by it. Then you go down to the Senate, and you hear the same speech. He'd been rehearsing for us. And they used to do filibusters. I think my grandfather lasted longest. I think he filibustered for something like 30 hours, which is very difficult because you had to have means of relieving yourself during the debate without leaving the floor. Otherwise, you'd lose your place. So they wore contraptions so that they could service themselves as they spoke. And Huey was just wonderful. He never ran out of talk. But he would end up giving recipes. You know, he'd done all the American history he could remember. And he said, now let me tell you how to make pot liquor. You don't know how to make pot liquor here. There isn't anybody in this Senate who knows how. We do it in Louisiana. You don't know how to do it. Now I'm going to tell you how you start with pot liquor. Now I want you to visualize. Now you visualize, and the whole country is listening to this guy. And he's trying to slow down some legislation by holding up the floor. And he'd get a pretty good recipe for pot liquor, or whatever it was that he was going to instruct you in. So that was fun. I can't say I was ever allowed in on great strategy meetings when they were out to destroy the New Deal. Ironically, I became a great New Dealer as time passed through my friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt years later. But I was in a nest of anti-New Dealers with my grandfather and the others. Huey was something else. Huey was a potential, dictator. But in the name of the people, he really wanted to spread the wealth around. And he had a lot of notions, not all of them crazy either. And to this day, his family thinks that Roosevelt had him killed. Ask any Long.
So, in a way, both by growing up in the senator's house, and do you feel like you were groomed to be a politician? No, I mean, there was no grooming. Sounds like it was deliberate and there was coercion. There wasn't any. I just wanted to be. Most sons of politicians, grandsons, are too frightened of it. They're too awed by their fathers or grandfathers, and they don't feel they're up to it. Or they don't want the responsibility, or they can't take the heat. I mean, your press is terrible if you're an active politician. You will never read anything very pleasant about yourself again. Or if you do, it'll be counterbalanced by 10 attacks. So you have to be very tough to want to do that. But I picked up on it, and I did want to do that. And being pretty well grounded in American history by my grandfather, who was born in 1870, and he certainly was able to tell me about the administration of President Grant and Reconstruction in the South. So I had a good background in the history of the country. But I was born a writer, and as I keep saying, you can't do both. So would you say that you were born into the ruling class?
Well, they certainly were ruling in the sense that a senator does rule, at least in those days. They had great power. There had been a war between Senate and between Congress and the executive. It always goes on. But there had been a period in history when everything was the executive. That happens during wartime. And obviously Lincoln was our first great dictator, and he suspended habeas corpus. He got rid of the Bill of Rights. He did extraordinary things. But he dies. The war is over. Then there was a placid period in which the Congress reasserted itself, and the presidents were weak. That changed with Theodore Roosevelt, who was an activist president. So the war between Congress and Theodore Roosevelt began, which culminated in Woodrow Wilson and the First World War, where the executive again took charge and the Senate began to fade a bit. Then the Senate, largely due at certain points to my grandfather, reasserted itself as being numero uno. This is after Wilson, and they rejected his League of Nations, and he died a wretched invalid, still in office. Then there was a quiet time, which was when I grew up. I was born in the regime of Calvin Coolidge, and the Senate was riding high, so people like my grandfather really were great powers in the land, and they knew it. And then came FDR, and he outsmarted everybody. And he had the Senate just jumping through hoops. And hence the bitterness of the old-time senators like my grandfather. Here was a president who didn't know his place. And then suddenly they realized he was going to get us into a world war, as his master Woodrow Wilson had done. And they found him evil. So the ruling class basically was the Senate, somewhat the House, and obviously, the judiciary a bit. Stuart Hughes was a very good historian at Harvard, I think it was. I used to know him slightly, and he was the grandson of Charles Evans Hughes, who was Chief Justice of the United States when I was a boy, candidate for president. And Hughes wrote toward the end of his life, he said, "I was once a member of a family that was once very famous in the United States." So everybody knew Charles Evans Hughes. With a beard, he looked like Jupiter. And suddenly, 30 years later, his grandson is writing, "I once belonged." So sic transit gloria mundi is the name of the game.
You've said if current dreams can be relied on, you have a memory of being born. Can you describe that?
I think I have a memory of being born. I don't pride myself on this memory, but it would explain a lifelong claustrophobia. I was born in the cadet hospital at West Point, and my mother had stayed over on a Saturday to watch the game, and I began to arrive, probably to avoid the game, that she wanted to see. My father was instructor in aeronautics, and he was football coach. So it was his team. Anyway, I ended up in the cadet hospital with the officer of the day, Major Snyder, who had not delivered a baby since he had been an intern years before. And cadets, by and large, don't have babies on the post. So there I was being delivered by him. And it should have been a cesarean section, and he didn't know what to do. My mother's pelvis was very narrow. And I got thoroughly squashed coming out. And I have I used to have, I don't seem to have it anymore, but for many years, a recurrent dream that I'm sort of facing, there's light at the end of some kind of a tunnel up ahead, and I'm trying to get through, and I'm stuck. And it is the claustrophobic dream of all time. And I am pushing my way out toward the light, and then I wake up, or shift to something equally appalling in the dream line. So I assume that is a birth dream, because then when I met Major Snyder, who became Major General Snyder, and he was Surgeon General of the Army and private physician to President Eisenhower. And I was asked to the White House, ordered to the White House by West Point, to write a speech for Eisenhower about integration. And I said, well, I'm on the other side. And he said, this is West Point, and we belong, it's like a family. And if the commander-in-chief wants you, you go. So I went there to write the speech, went straight downstairs to have my first meeting with General Snyder since he delivered me. And I said, what about the back of my head? He said, it's a wonder you're alive. Your mother's a damn fool. You should have gone to a proper hospital. Cadet hospital for a baby, she said. That's asking for trouble. This is the same Major General Snyder, who, when Eisenhower was having his heart attack, his wife rang him very disturbed, and he said, Mamie, it's only gas. And he nearly lost us, a great president, and squashed my head.
There was an incident involving the playpen when you got your head. My understanding was that was the beginning of claustrophobia.
No, that had its kind of exciting side to it. It was one of those cribs that are high, and I was already able to stand up and walk around. And I had stuck my head between the bars and, of course, couldn't withdraw it, so I got stuck. And I yelled up a storm, and my grandmother was in her house. She came up and liberated me. It's my first vivid memory of her, and I suppose one of the first memories of anything. So the problem always was that my head was a bit in advance of the universe that I was inhabiting.
There was, you were with your grandfather in Washington, riding in the back of a limousine, and it was the Boners, Boners, where the rock was thrown to the window and landed between the two of you.
Well, it was my first confrontation with real politics, as opposed to senators conspiring. My first knowledge that one day, you see, this was 1930, Hoover was still president, so it must have been 31 or 2. The veterans of the First World War felt that they had been badly dealt with, and they marched on Washington, and they said they wanted a bonus, which they'd been idly promised at one point for having served in the First World War. At the height of the Depression, everybody's unemployed, so they march on Washington to ask for their bonus. Hence the nickname for them, the Boners. The Boners have come to town. And they came by the thousands, and we were all still shaking from 1917, from the Russian Revolution, not to mention there were still vestigial memories of the French Revolution. And it can't happen here was always an American feeling, but this was the first time I realized that it could happen here. And everybody's terrified. And immediately Congress went into session to decide whether to give them the bonus. They had settled outside of town, the edge of town, in the Anacostia Flats, which is now all black, and equally unpleasant as it was when the bonus army was encamped there. So President Hoover calls on General MacArthur and his aide, Major Eisenhower, to call out the troops to protect the city from this invasion. And boners didn't mean anything to me. I thought these were skeletons, like Halloween, those jointed cardboard skeletons they used to have. So I was rather alarmed that a bunch of skeletons had marched on the city. Well, I drove to the Senate with my grandfather and sat in the back of the car with him. And there the boners were lined up, and it was nothing but ordinary men in rather poor clothing. They didn't look terribly well fed. But they were hostile. They were not friendly, but I mean, there were no weapons or anything. But they recognized Senator Gore as we drove by. All the traffic had been slowed down, and we were headed for the Senate side of the Capitol. And suddenly, crash, a rock came through the back window of the car, which was down, and landed between my grandfather and me. And all he said was just, put up the window. But I was well and truly traumatized, is too strong a word, but I was warned that one day those who felt that they should have more than the rulers of the United States had granted them in the way of jobs, or rewards for having fought in wars out of which they got nothing, that one day they will overthrow this government. And I think that day may be closer now than it was back in 31 or 2. But it is quite true when they say that Roosevelt's presence as president after Hoover saved the country from revolution. So from that day to this, where the boners, I can hear the sound of that rock landing on the back seat of the car and realizing this will happen again.
Did your grandfather try to explain?
Yeah. He was against, I remember that he was blind at 10. His family had some money. They were prosperous by Southern standards. So they could send him to law school with a cousin to read to him. But he got to the Senate at the age of 37 all by himself with no great money, with nothing behind him. And he thought a man with 2 eyes in a country like the United States, they still believe it's a country of great opportunity for everybody. He would always say, they can see. I said, what do you think it's like for somebody who can't see anything? But I've survived, and they damn well should too. It was very Darwinian, rather cruel. But that's the way people were in those days, or some people. No, I knew just what it was about, and I thought they shouldn't have a bonus, since that's what I was told. Now I see, well, why not? It's a small price to pay to get them to go home. Then General MacArthur opens fire, and they go out to Anacostia, and they burn down the shacks that they've built. And I think a couple of babies died of smoke inhalation. I mean, it was a mess. And when people talk about, oh, United States, everybody's so happy, everybody's so rich, and so on. At about 7 years old, I realized they were not happy, and they were not rich. And they had come to town, and we were scared. Well, the Japanese had attacked the United States, and you see, in those days, we believed in the United States, we the people. In fact, we the people thought it was our country, since that is what the slogan of the United States is. All power resides in we the people in Congress assembled. We the people had been attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. We didn't know that the attack had been provoked by President Roosevelt. We now know that, and I've just written a book about it called The Golden Age, which has caused much furor because we're still trying to lie about what actually happened December 7th, 1941. So, when your country is attacked, you enlist in the army. You didn't think twice about it. The army, acting as we eventually discovered in perfect bad faith, so that if you entered at 17, I graduated from Exeter, which is like a high school, in June, and in July I enlisted, and they had a special training program, which after 3 or 4 months they dissolved and threw us all into the infantry. I was able to signal what is known as the WPPA, the West Point Protective Association, and get myself into the Air Force, into Army boats, which I ended up in the Aleutian Islands as first mate of a ship. My fellow teenagers who had enlisted at 17 had practically no basic training, no basic skills, and were shipped off to this famous Battle of the Bulge. And they were literally decimated. So much for the good faith of the American Army. But why did I enlist? That's what you did do. Far more exceptional would be somebody who didn't. The only person I can think of that I knew who didn't was the poet Robert Lowell, who I think was a genuine conscientious objector. That was considered a fair ground, but it was also considered rather slightly shady.
Well, that brings us to Willowa. When and where did you start writing?
Well, as soon as I got to, our ship was stationed at Chernovsky Bay on the island of Unalaska, and we had a weekly run, sometimes more often, from Chernovsky Bay to Dutch Harbor, which was the sort of capital of the chain, where we'd pick up supplies and passengers. We had a 20-man crew, and then take them back to Chernovsky Bay or further along to the island of Umnak. And if you're an officer, you have a long watch in port. Sometimes generally at sea, it'd be maybe 4 hours. At nighttime in port, it'd be 8 hours. And you can't really sleep, you're not supposed to. And so I wrote a book about a storm at sea. Having never experienced a willowa. Willowa is the Indian word for a great wind that comes down out of the mountains. And very scary they are. I've been on the edges of willowas, but I was never actually in one, such as I described. But I use that as a kind of unifying theme for what proved to be my first published book after 6 or 7 aborted attempts.
In the introduction, you said that the precision of style and will reflects an inner tension. What was that? What were you referring to?
I don't remember writing that. Don't remember what I meant. The inner tension was largely because there was suddenly a great shortage of officers. The Army had a larger fleet in numbers, not in freightage, but than the Navy. It had thousands of little boats, particularly in the Pacific, north and south. Well, I hadn't had enough experience. I studied a book of navigation and passed the exam. No one had enough experience unless you were an old sailor from the Bering Sea. I mean, you could never sight a course. You never saw the stars. It was always clouded over. We did point-to-point navigation, and every point looked like every other point, just a bit of rock sticking out in the sea. And the inner tension was simply terror that I was going to wreck the ship when I was in charge. And then at night time, and I would be sitting there on duty, and it was my watch, I relieved myself by writing this book, imagining that the worst had happened. Negative magic. If I can imagine it, it won't happen. It proved that it didn't happen, but the book did.
Also in this author's note, you said you started and then abandoned the book. You were full of self-contempt because you could never finish anything.
Yeah.
Why were you having trouble finishing the things you started at that?
I had trouble. Well, nature had intervened. I got hit by it wasn't even much of a wave, but if you fell into the Bering Sea at that time of year, I think you were dead in 3 minutes. Well, if you got yourself thoroughly wet, as I did out on deck, doing my first mate duties, I was semi-frozen, and I came down with rheumatoid arthritis. And this kept me quite busy. And I hadn't realized how bad it was. I wasn't frozen, but it was a trauma, shock, hypothermia. And I remember to this day, this is my Lord Jim experience, we were putting into port at Dutch Harbor, and the first mate is out in the bow in charge of the spring line, which is the first line that you use to attach yourself to the wharf. And then the stern comes around, and by then the skipper is on duty and you're looking after the deck. So the spring line was duly attached, and I had thrown it aboard onto the wharf. And the next move is just to go and jump from the side of the ship onto the wharf, distance of maybe 3 feet. And I couldn't jump. My knees locked. Now, whether it was panic or whether something had really seriously gone wrong, I don't know. And then I had a big row with the skipper over it. And I said, well, I don't think I can make this jump. He said, well, you better have somebody take a look at it. And they took X-ray, and they found silicone chips, whatever they are, the things that you get when you have arthritis, had started in my knees, but I probably could have made the jump. But I was afraid I couldn't complete the jump, and then I would be in the water. This does not make for a bold first mate, so I was put in the hospital at Anchorage, sent to Birmingham General Hospital at Van Nuys, told I could get a pension, but they were going to keep me in another 2 years as a mess officer at Camp Gordon Johnson in Apalachicola, Florida. I said, just let me out. The war was over by then. And they said, all right, you'll serve some duty down there and you'll be got out. So I went down there and was mess officer with 50 Italian prisoners and 50 German prisoners of war. So we no longer had kitchen police. There was no more KP. Everybody's very happy about that. And I had 100 of these kids looking after the mess hall. And then you are officer of day, and I took over the headquarters one night, all alone. Everything's all lit up, and thousands of typewriters. And I had been unable to continue with Willowaw because I was in and out of hospitals. And I had gone to see Isle of the Dead with Boris Karloff. It's a wonderful movie. Still, I find quite good. And there was a storm warning out of the Gulf. And I'm all alone with all these typewriters, and I just went over and I started typing, and I finished Willowaw there. So whether it was the storm, hypothermia, or Boris Karloff, we will never know.
Willowaw was one of the first American war novels.
Chronologically, yes.
What were some of the others, and which was the best?
Well, the first one out was A Walk in the Sun by Harry Brown, poet, very good writer. We became friends later. It was turned into quite a good movie directed by Louis Milestone. And then came John Hersey's A Bell for Adano, I think it was called, which is commercial fiction. And then came, I was published in 46, those two were a year or so before me. In 47 came the best, it was called The Gallery by John Horne Burns. It's about Naples over here, the Galleria, and about how this frozen Irishman in the army comes to life in the Galleria. And Italy has thawed him out, and the war has thawed him out. And he's having sort of a nervous breakdown there, and the Allies have just taken Naples. And I think it's a beautiful book, but it's been erased with so much else.
What about Norman's?
Norman came in 1948, simultaneously with The City and the Pillar, which is my third book. And I never got through his. It was very long. I thought, well, it's clever that he's picked the Pacific to write about, because the First World War obviously took place in Europe, so they wrote about Europe. But the Pacific was basically more interesting. It was a race war, for one thing. It was the yellow people against white people. And we were all trained to be racists. That was our indoctrination. So it had all sorts of resonances as a war, which a power war on the continent of Europe didn't have. And Norman got a lot of that quite right. But he didn't really interest me, because after all, he owed a good deal to Malraux. That man's fate, I think it was. Yes, bringing the body down the mountain. When I got to that, I thought, well, I think I've read this. Then in 1952 came From Here to Eternity, which I could never get through. And that's it for war novels.
Thin Red Line? Yeah. Why was, you also wrote in the author's note, war was an irresistible subject, particularly for a young man?
Well, it's obviously one of the interesting pursuits of the human race, or else we wouldn't have had so much of it. Also, what else are you going to write about? I was 19 when I finished Willowa. I was hardly ready yet to do a definitive analysis of Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, and the Senate. I waited until the Golden Age in Washington, D.C. to do those books, because I didn't know enough to do them. So you write about what is your most immediate experience, and being first mate of a ship was.
Evans, strange phrases and jingles often came to him, or words he avuncular.
Oh, yes, I'm as old as gold is cold. Well, you know, we were all going crazy up there. There were no women at all, not even nurses, I guess, when you got on the mainland, Anchorage and so on, but out on the chain, as we call the islands. There was no life of any kind. And you were stuck with 20 men on a ship, and you got on each other's nerves beyond belief. There was one guy who hated the way he combed his hair. He just kept combing it and combing it. He was Norwegian. It was long blonde hair, and he kept combing it. And there were times I really thought if I took a match and set fire to it, at least he wouldn't be able to comb it anymore for a while. You start going mad. We had nothing but ravens and foxes. These were the only indigenous population. The Indians had all been moved out. Well, the foxes didn't come our way very much, but the ravens were all over the place. They were pretty tame. They're huge birds. And there are a lot of guys who just take them into the hut and talk to them. Better talk to a raven than talk to your buddies, whom by then you are really thinking seriously about killing them, just to get rid of their presence and the monotony and the fact that at that level of society, which I didn't know much about, I mean, these were the people of the country. And without any education, any curiosity, and the vocabularies were so limited. Smitty, the cook who figures in the book, I mean, he had about 4 phrases. And he was native-born American. We had a lot of Aleut Indians who spoke limited English, but they had a good reason since it wasn't their first language. But, it was, you really know what boredom is, and then you start to know what obsession is. And what works in Willowa, I think, still. Somebody sent me a PhD thesis on it. Somebody really studied it, found a lot more in the book than I ever did, but that it really was an obsessive book, and what this sort of isolation does to people. I mean, there's a murder in it that everybody knows who does the murder, and they decide it's just too much trouble to do anything about it. So I was hailed as the first existential American novel. This was hailed as the first existential American novel. And I hadn't even read Sartre at the time, and I was quite pleased with my new adjective.
I grew up racing sailboats, and the whole thing racing was just reading the water. And the better you could read the water, the more successful you were. And there's a lot of descriptions of water.
That's about all you saw was water and sky. I mean, to this day, the second I'm up right here on the divine coast of Amalfi, first thing I check is the direction of the wind. And I can figure out what the day is going to be like, even with universal global warming. You have a pretty good idea if you awaken to an east wind or a west wind. Not to mention the north wind, which is really cold. Comes from Russia.
But did the sea have an effect on the imaginary mind of the...
Well, it throws the mind in on itself. And it's no accident that so many writers have come out of the sea, with Conrad as the most famous one, Jack London. I mean, it is conducive to meditation, to, as I say, to obsession. You start to think the same thoughts over and over again. One of my characters, Evans, is constantly doing jingles. He's constantly rhyming things in his head. He's not going to be a writer. He's not going to be a poet. But his brain is beginning to feed upon itself. I think I wrote somewhere that the unfed brain devours itself. Well, we certainly weren't being fed much of anything except each other, and we were sick of that diet.
Gore, you wrote in Screening History that writing Washington, D.C. started you in writing this cycle of books, the Chronicles, and you said that you redreamed the Republic's history. In what way is the history of the Republic a family affair for you?
Well, because my mother's family, the Gores, have been here since the 17th century, and a direct ancestor of mine fought in the Revolution. And one of the family stories was that he got lost in the woods and was so famished that he killed and ate a black snake. And that story has come down right to this very moment. It's not very interesting, but he did eat a black snake, which was his principal memory of the Revolution, which has the ring of truth to it. And we were, the Gores, they started out in Maryland. We owned most of what is now Washington, D.C. And then George Washington came, and when they moved the capital from Philadelphia to make a new capital near his home in Monticello, when they moved the capital from Philadelphia to close to his home at Mount Vernon, Washington made an offer that the Gores could not resist and bought up their farm, which is where the White House now is, up most of Pennsylvania Avenue toward Capitol Hill. And then we headed west. West in those days meant Alabama and Mississippi. So we ended up in northern Mississippi. And at one point we owned the better part of two counties, Chickasaw County and Webster County. Indians were displaced by President Andrew Jackson by then. And in due course, my grandfather founded the state of Oklahoma, probably the last state to be so founded by really one person. And at the time of the Civil War, we were, although in northern Mississippi, we were Unionists, patriots, as the family called themselves. After all, we'd helped create the United States. We'd served various offices in the state and some in the federal government. And we were against secession. But in the long run, we stayed and fought my great-grandfather with his brothers. And in due course, he was wounded and taken captive at Shiloh. Our family, that branch of it, my mother's branch, were totally involved in the history of the country, politically, as recently as the election of the year 2000, so brilliantly resolved by the Supreme Court. That's a family affair. The Vidals arrived late, same year as the Kennedys, 1848. For different reasons. The Kennedys were on the move from Ireland. We were on the move from Vorarlberg, from northern Italy, and from Switzerland, which was at one point all one province of Romana Raetia, and we went out to Wisconsin, which the nickname for Wisconsin in 1848 was Swissconsin, because it was filled with Swiss people, German-speaking people. And my great-great-grandfather was I believe, the only person to have gone into the Swiss cheese business in Racine, Wisconsin, and failed, which took some doing. But then his grandsons, he had two of them, my father and my uncle, immediately went to West Point and became involved in the American military. And my father founded 2 or 3 airlines. So we were always involved in the history of the country, even the latecomers like the Vidals and the early comers like the 17th century Gores. So when I started with Washington, D.C., I was, in a sense, wasn't writing so much about my family, but I wrote about a lot of our houses. Marywood, which is the model for Laurel House in Washington, D.C., and in the Golden Age. Senator Gore's house in Rock Creek Park, now the Malaysian Embassy, where I spent my first 10 years, is sort of a model for Senator James Burdenday's house. I used a lot of real geography, but not so many real people, though there are echoes of events from my life. And obviously, since I first moved to Washington when I was about 2 months old, 3 months old in 1925, that has been the center of my family's world and my world. I then watched it become the center of the global empire, which it is today. So how could it not be a family affair? But I didn't think when I wrote Washington, D.C., that was about 1966 or 7, that I would suddenly get so curious. Who were we? Where did we come from? By we, I mean what we call Americans. And what we call Americans are so many different things. There are Native Americans of Mongol extraction. There are Black Americans who were brought against their will to be slaves. There are Middle Europa, North Italians like the Vidals. And then there are the Gores who are Anglo-Irish. Tribally, we're nothing, and religiously, we're mixed up. Imperially, I think we had something in common, but I was going to have to find out, wasn't I? I start in media race with Franklin Roosevelt getting ready to run again for president. And the Second War is on. And we suddenly have an emperor on our hands. He got elected to a 3rd term, something no one had ever done before. he was going to get us into the Second World War or die in the attempt, and he got us in. And out of that, whether one approves of the war or not, out of that came our primacy in the world. So as I was completing Washington, D.C., and there was Franklin Roosevelt in the background, I thought to myself, one day I really should put him in the foreground and put my fictional people off to one side as sort of a Greek chorus. But then maybe I better go further back. And in the family, my stepfather, Mr. Auchincloss' mother was a Jennings, and her father had been a partner of John D. Rockefeller. And her, I forget what it was, but one of her great uncles was a relative, was a Burr from Connecticut. So they were related to the Burrs. And I knew all along from within the family that Burr had had a bad rap. He had taken on, his two main enemies were Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Well, he picked his enemies so well that he erased himself from American history. So I thought, I think I'll focus on Burr, because he has a very odd, different view of the Founding Fathers, of which he is one, too. And that carried me then to Burr, having done Washington, D.C., the 6th out of 7 books. Then I go back to what is chronologically the first, and that was Burr, which goes from the Revolution up to about 1836. And then I would tell the story through a family not unlike my own, a family that mixes in politics, and is in a position to know very often what is really happening as opposed to what is supposed to be happening.
Great. Let's go right to Burr then. You had a wonderful phrase. I don't have it right in front of me, and so you'll have to correct me if I get it wrong. That came, I think it was out of the Golden Age. I forget which book, where you said Burr had this. You called it a right angle, or what maybe it was screening history. A right angle on. I'll come across it. I wrote it down.
Yeah.
Why did you write a novel instead of a biography?
I don't really admire the art of biography. I'm addicted to them. I like to read them. This is a great period for biography. We've got a number of very good biographers. And without them, I couldn't have written my Narratives of Empire, is what I call the series. The word chronicle, which is kind of a klutzy word, was thought up by a publisher. Eventually, I'll get rid of it, but I call them Narratives of Empire because that's what the story is, how we became a world empire in 200 years, the trick of the week, really. And that's what this series is about. How thought out it was, how accidental it was, how lucky it was, unlucky for others maybe. So, where were we? What was your question?
Well, I asked why a novel instead of a biography, but I think we may have talked about that the other day.
Well, no, it's a biography of Burr is just a biography of Burr. Where's the interest in that? The story of a family, not unlike my own, in which I can weave in my own experiences and my own views, as well as those of others whom I have known along the way, who have strong opinions. It's much richer to do it. The pity is that the historical novel has been so disdained for so long, and in many ways quite rightly. It's junkie writers write historical novels, that is common knowledge and common misapprehension, until really George Eliot began to write morality tracts for the lower classes to keep them from committing adultery and becoming alcoholics and so on. the Biedermeier novels, as I call them, the novels of everyday folks doing everyday things. Everything was historical, for God's sake. What is Aeschylus? What is Sophocles? What is Euripides? They're writing about kings and great events in the history of their country, the history of their stories of their gods. On to Dante, there again is heaven and hell and the great figures of history who get in one or the other or in between. What is Shakespeare but nothing but a series of narratives about the history of this little island, and the history is extremely fascinating. Here in 200 years, we created a world empire out of a really interesting mix of people, many of whom were considered the refuse of Europe and other continents. And yet somehow something about coming together in this place gave us energy, and we just opened new doors, sometimes deliberately and sometimes not understanding what we were doing. Well, that to me is a story. Why it has not been done by anyone else, I don't know. I picked it as a novel. I've seen historians try to do it, and most of them don't succeed. We have wonderful historians who get parts of it. William Appleman Williams is a great one on the American Empire specifically. But he has to approach it formally through foreign relations and how we made this treaty and that treaty and so on. And he's a wonderful writer. But you don't get a coherent picture of it. Charles A. Beard at least came up with the notion that the Founding Fathers had profit in view and created a constitution in which only white men of property could do well. He grasped that, which is one of our big secrets that we tried to keep from the rest of the world. People like Richard Hofstadter, whom I admire very much, is good with the paranoid style. He gets a lot of the games we play politically. But there is no sense of... nobody has written a Washington, D.C. novel. I read a list of Washington, D.C. novels, and I didn't appear on it. I don't know what people think it is that I do, but I seem not to be writing history, and I seem not to be writing what should be novels, which are about divorce and who gets custody of the children, important things. And yet I have done nothing but one vast, in 7 volumes, Washington novel about who's in the White House, who's achieved power, who has gone out, who has created a war with Spain, as did Teddy Roosevelt to give us a Pacific empire. Then another Roosevelt provokes the Japanese into attacking us at Pearl Harbor, which gives us all of the Pacific, and the island of Japan as a dependency, as a conquered province, which it is as we speak. And all of Europe is now under our control. They get hysterical when you tell them that, and I remind them how many bases. England's got 10 American bases, military bases, as we speak, in those small islands. Well, how did it happen? Well, I found that through Burr himself, who was always at an angle, oblique angle, to the pieties of the Founding Fathers, he was on to them. And he was a very witty man, a witty writer, left a good deal in the way of notes and journals. He was on to the hypocrisy of people like Jefferson. It was not that Jefferson was not a wise and sometimes good man, and God knows eloquent. Declaration of Independence is probably the great paper of the 18th century. But he fooled himself about everything. Louisiana Purchase, he buys something that's about the size of Russia and pretends he can have a little democracy going on. Well, you can't with an empire of that size. So Burr is there as my first voice, saying, well, no, it's not really like that. Jefferson was not that sort of person. He had other things in view than the pursuit of happiness for, let us say, the lesser breeds, as he regarded Native Americans and blacks. So I start with that, then I move on to, I go from that to Lincoln, which is kind of a deviation, but without the Civil War in Lincoln, nothing makes any sense. Only one member of my family ends up in Lincoln in a minor role. He in turn marries the daughter of the illegitimate son of Aaron Burr, and that's my family that runs straight through to the Golden Age. And they marry different people, and we go through about 5 generations of them, which brings us to the present day. Well, during this time, the country is changing, the family is changing. We are forever at war, and it's always other people who are very evil, and they just attack us for no reason at all, and we have to fight back reluctantly. Well, there was a pattern for empire which I didn't understand when I began these narratives. And by the time I got to the last one, the Golden Age, it all starts to come together. I see that from the beginning that this was an inexorable pattern, that it was the nature of the beast, particularly, we have to bring up the delicate subject of race, but particularly the Anglo-Irish and Scots-Irish, who are an aggressive breed, as the world keeps noting whenever we look at Ireland, we see that something awful is going on there, and they're feuding. Well, it was that breed. 11 of our presidents have been from Ulster. These are Protestant Irish, mean as can be, and very, very tough and aggressive. Well, when you have people like Andrew Jackson, or even I think Woodrow Wilson was one, of that breed, you've got a very tough leadership. Mr. John Updike, a writer that I cannot say that I much care for, as he is too Biedermeier for my taste. He really believes in the sanctities of marriage and divorce. But he did a memoir. It was very interesting. He's of German extraction. I suppose must have been Catholic, at least at the beginning. And he's talking about being from Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania Dutch, which were from the Rhine Valley. He said, we stayed put in the same villages that we arrived in the 17th, 18th century. And you go to the cemeteries, and there the families are. We just stayed there, worked the land, got planted, new group came. We didn't have the energy to move on. And then it's he who brings up my theme. It was the Scots-Irish. And he didn't know about the Anglo-Irish, which the Gores are, but it's their restlessness. And they just kept moving west. I just noticed the Gores. They had to keep moving. Whenever there was word that there was land in Alabama, Pickens, Alabama, the Gores rushed out of South Carolina to grab that land. Then when Jackson got rid of the Indians there, we zoomed up to the northern part of the state to where the Chickasaw tribe had been and bought them out and drove them out. And at one point we owned, I think it was 2 counties. Then, irony of ironies, the Chickasaws had been moved to the Indian territories. So my grandfather, the Gores having already occupied Chickasaw land, moves to Oklahoma and puts the Chickasaws on reservations, takes all their land away from them. Then when we find out there's oil in the reservations, we get them off the reservations and steal the oil. Bad faith, I would say, was our great weapon in empire building, but I suspect we could make the same comment of the Romans.
Can you skip to Lincoln for a second? What role does Lincoln play in the transformation of the Republic to an empire?
Well, Lincoln was more... Lincoln replaced the Republic. We had been a loose confederation of states. Part of our mythology, and this is the sort of thing that drove Aaron Burr crazy and drives me crazy. Oh, you see, he fought the Civil War to free the slaves in the South. Well, he didn't fight to free the slaves. He didn't care. He said, if I can save the Union, was what he cared about. He didn't want the Union breaking up. And he didn't want the South seceding, and the South was seceding right and left, starting with South Carolina. And he threatened them. He said, you can't go. And they said, why not? we came together of our own free will to form a more perfect union, a republic. And now is the time for us to part, try and stop us. And Lincoln said, not a word, Lincoln said, if I can preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, I shall do so, though I don't have the power. If I can preserve the Union by freeing some of the slaves and not others, I will do so. If I can preserve the Union by freeing no slaves, I will free none. That's how good an abolitionist he was. In the end, he freed the ones in the South as military necessity, which was just to cause turmoil in the Confederacy, which was staggering under the powers of the North. But what he did, he made himself dictator. He suspended habeas corpus. He shut down newspapers. He imprisoned anybody he felt like it without due process of law. And he became more and more fierce and more stern in the extreme measures that he took to smash the South to pieces so that this would never happen again. And he succeeded. And that is why the most moving lines are in his second inaugural address. He's reporting to the nation. And it's 4 years after the secession had begun, after he had first become president. And he said, you know, I have to paraphrase it, but he said, the matters of war and peace were decided not by me, but by others. He says in so many words, I begged you to stay in the Union, and you would not. Then he brings up slavery as a bad thing, because he was now in the business of freeing the slaves. But he said there were those who preferred to earn their living through the sweat of others. And there were those opposed. And it need not have become an issue, but it did. And so the choice was of the choice of others, not mine. And then the war came. And that is the voice of Caesar. You asked for it, you got it. I got a brand new country. And he predicted himself when he was about 29, a young legislator in Springfield, Illinois. He made a speech to the Young Men's Lyceum. And he talking about power. He's an unknown legislator. And he said, you know, he's very nice about George Washington, the founders of the country. But he said, will this be enough for the ambitious man? For a man of the race of the lion and of the eagle, simply to occupy the presidential chair which others have occupied? Or will he not seek new fields in which he will shine? Might not his ambition lead him to free all the slaves or enslave all men? He will not be content to be mere successor. And there's Lincoln warning us against Lincoln, because he wasn't going to just succeed in the chair of George Washington. There was going to be a great marble throne, and that was Abraham Lincoln.
Do you think he was the most ambitious of all our presidents?
Well, how do you measure ambition? I don't know. Maybe Millard Fillmore might have been more ambitious. He just did less about it. I would say he accomplished an impossible task. He smashed up the old republic, reinvented it as a highly centralized militaristic state, which we still are, brought down states' rights, minimized them, centralized everything. We were the most powerful military nation on earth by 1865. Bismarck, from Germany, Napoleon III, we were sending observers to watch the terrible new weapons that we had developed. We developed the first iron ships, battleships that had ever been put to sea. We reinvented war, and we killed more people in one day than had ever been killed in one day. I think that was at Cold Spring Harbor, General Grant.
Tell me about looking at the contents of Lincoln's pockets at the Library of Congress. And can I remind you to look at me again, a little more than you are, because we want to be seeing you looking in this direction. So it's wonderful stories.
Well, I went to the Library of Congress. I was invited to do sort of a commercial for them. They were doing a TV documentary on it. And they brought out a life mask, of Lincoln. Rather startling. This tiny, tiny face. It looks like he had such a big head, but that was all hair and beard, and probably why he grew the beard. But you can't see the beard has been taped over and the hair is taped over, so all you get is really his features. And this little sort of vulpine, like a little fox's face. Very weary, with terrible lines in it, sharp-pointed nose. And he, everybody thinks it's a death mask, and it was done about 2 months before he was murdered. Then they had the contents of his pockets on the night that he was shot at Ford's Theater. And there were his glasses. It's the same pair that he is wearing reading the second inaugural address, with malice toward none and charity toward all, that speech. So I just picked them up and I put them on. I put Lincoln's glasses on. The curator was gasping and trying to get them out of my hands without breaking them, but I was going to look through Lincoln's glasses. Well, I don't know, the glass must have changed because it was like looking through mica. It was this total glaze. Apparently he must have been terribly farsighted because he needed them for reading, which meant that his regular eyes couldn't read text very easily. He had in his pockets a couple of editorials, a couple of good reviews that he'd got lately from across the country. He had a $10 Confederate bill that he had picked up in the streets of Richmond. He'd been in Richmond a week or two before, which is the Confederate capital. And then he had a knife. He liked to whittle all the time. There was his pocket knife. And then they also produced the Bible, on which he had sworn to uphold the Constitution. And it was brand new. It had never been opened. So I opened that to the consternation of the curator, because you could see it was a brand new 1865 Bible. They had to send out for it. Lincoln was not a believer in our Lord Jesus, though he certainly believed in Almighty God at the end. Almighty God gets into every speech by his last term. So I opened it, all the pages stuck together, and it was just, this thing had never been opened. They just kept it as a sacred relic. And it was important to him, though, that Bible, because when they asked him, by what right do you deny the South's right to withdraw from a union in which they have voluntarily joined and now voluntarily wanted to leave? He couldn't think of an argument because there was none. So he said, because I have an oath sworn and registered in heaven to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Well, it isn't quite true, but it really worked. That was his rationale. So the little red Bible I was holding in my hand, on which he had put his hand, that was his justification and the war came.
I love the way that you used varying perspectives to give us the portrait of Lincoln, seeing him through Mary Todd's eyes, seeing him through young Charlie Hayes' eyes, and also, and I liked, I mean, everyone
Audio
knows
cassette
he's
flips.
a very melancholy man. I mean,
Audio cassette
I
flips.
heard of someone recently who's, doing a study of depression, and
he was seriously, chronically depressed. Everybody was upset because I brought up the fact that he had told his law partner that he had had syphilis in his late 20s and had a difficult time being cured of it, and had to go to, he didn't dare go to a Springfield doctor because they'd all talk, so he went to Cincinnati. But was he cured or not? And the cure then was mercury. Well, this was such an unsavory thing. Everybody was horrified that I had mentioned this, but since his law partner had written about it, I thought it's common knowledge. It was necessary because his melancholy and these swings in moods and sometimes moments of real madness conform with mercury poisoning. He also took a laxative called blue mass, and blue mass contained mercury. And finally, over the years, he himself figured out that there was something wrong with him and actually got it down to the pills, the blue mass. By then he was not being cured for syphilis, but he was taking constipation pills. And he immediately said how much better he felt when he stopped taking them. So the melancholy, I think, was medically induced, as so much is that we are not told about until we're dead.
I also love the way he seemed so indecisive, and then all of a sudden you realize how he seemed to be totally on top of the game.
Well, David Herbert Donald, who's probably the greatest living authority on Lincoln, made the point, I think he used it as a title for his last book on Lincoln, but it's from a letter of Lincoln. He said, I have not controlled events. Events have controlled me. And Donald thinks that is more of a clue to his character than I do. I think he controlled events as much as he could. No one can control events totally because nobody knows what's going to happen next. The true politician waits and is never precipitate. And you have to keep waiting till the right moment to strike and to respond. So the great politicians are always accused of dithering. Franklin Roosevelt. I have this in the Golden Age, and this is from life. President Roosevelt was talking to a friend of mine about the necessity to go to war to save England, but 80% of the American people did not want to go and fight in Europe. And Roosevelt is trying to persuade them to go and is having a very difficult time of it. And Roosevelt said something interesting. He said, the only way that you can get me to do something that I don't want to do, or I feel that I cannot do, you must force me. And the president said, well, how do we force the president? Well, he said, you have a newspaper. Accuse me of cowardice or refusal to respond to history. Accuse me. And then he said, there's a word I've always liked, and I never see it anymore. Accuse me of being pusillanimous. So pusillanimous made its way into the newspapers, and nobody knew it came from Roosevelt to the journalist. And he got his wish. He saw the word, and finally he got his war.
I had the feeling that history was almost a character throughout the narratives.
Oh, by the end, of course, it's about nothing but history. There's all my characters sort of... I am suggested somewhat by the Tempest, by Prospero finally seeing all of his creations as he breaks his magic stick. And we have Aaron Burr sort of returns in the last scenes, and what is real, what isn't? Are these fictional characters real? Well, they're real to themselves if they have selves. They're real to me when I contemplate them. They will be real to a reader at a certain level. So what's what? And is it not all perhaps a dream? Buddhists would say that. So it's so indeterminate. And one of my problems with the academics is they really believe there's such things as facts, as truth. There are what I call agreed upon facts. We all agree that George Washington was born in February. He could well have been born in March. But nobody's going to take the time to worry about it. As far as we can tell, we've got the right date for his birth. John Hay. I have the two standard biographies of John Hay, who was Secretary to Lincoln and later Secretary of State to McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt. The two standard biographies have him born on a different day. Well, now, what am I to do with that when all of my sources disagree? And nobody's ever thought it of interest to straighten it out. You're already dealing on such quicksand when you come to history. Then Americans, I would say a primary American trait is hypocrisy about everything. If you can't be good, be careful. And if the truth will get you in trouble, lie and keep on lying. This is very much in our nature. In fact, there was a study by two researchers called The Day America Told the Truth. And over 90% of the people interviewed admitted to being habitual liars. Well, they're going to be the people who talk to the historians, and they're going to tell you all kinds of stories. That is why, in the long run, it might be that a somewhat history-minded novelist who is quick to figure out motives of characters might be better at reconstructing historical action than somebody who's just reading the latest monographs that came out of a close reading of the Springfield Gazette, in which practically every story is untrue. But since it's an original source, they say it has to be true.
Well, going back to what you were just talking about, dream and reality, and the ending of the Golden Age, the concept of parallel universe comes up. Mm. Could you tell me about that and how you use that so wonderfully in the last chapter?
Well, I use the parallel universe head on in a book called The Smithsonian Institution, written just before the Golden Age, in which I withdraw from death somebody who is going to be killed and rearrange by stepping into a parallel universe. I read an awful lot of physics for that book. And it's theoretically possible. It's practically, I should think, impossible, but it's good for a narrative, a fictional narrative. So having already worked it out, how it might happen, I then, at the very end, my central character, who you might say is kind of a stand-in for me, though we're very different. We're the same age, we're both brought up in Washington, and we're meeting here in this house a year ago, right after the millennium. And we are sort of reviewing our life and times, and as we do so, everything starts to get unreal, because after all, I am the writer, and he's my character, and he may think I'm his character, but we don't know what he's writing, but we know what I am. And so I begin, and we have a TV director who really is Aaron Burr come back again. And he said something to the effect, I said, "You are Aaron Burr, aren't you?" He said, "If that's what you want me to be, of course." And I said, "What will you do this time?" Oh, he said, it won't be political. There's something else that is going to happen to the human race. Something much bigger than anything a politician might do. but he doesn't say, and I don't say. The last sentence of the book gives an indication of what it might be, and the last sentence of the Golden Age is exactly the last sentence of Washington, D.C., bringing those two books together.
Well, I thought it was really fascinating that you started, the first book you wrote was Washington, D.C. The last book you wrote of the Empire series, narratives, was the Golden Age, and you covered the same period of time. And was it interesting? It was very interesting to read, because I read them in the chronological order of not how you wrote them, but their time period in the book. So I read Washington, D.C., second to last, and then Golden Age. So I was reading about the same period of time with some of the same characters and some not. Carolyn Sanford isn't there in Washington, D.C., and she's very much there, although she has her extraordinary end scene, which is one of my favorites in the Golden Age. And Peter Sanford, who is, I guess, your somewhat stand-in. But it must have been very interesting for you to write the Golden Age. It's almost like another level of reality. You're dealing with the same, some of the FDR and the same events, but playing. It's almost like a variation on a theme.
Well, to go back to the central situation and the fictional characters of Washington, D.C., I did it because I felt that what's really interesting, which I left out of that, were the great historical figures. So more center stage is Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins and Henry Wallace. And I put the historical figures at center stage, and then my fictional ones observe them, and they do what they do. But you see the things that they were doing that you don't see what they did. You can observe the fictional characters in the Golden Age pursuing their lives as they did in Washington, D.C., with the same major events shadowing them, but the emphasis is totally changed. It's on something else. So all those scenes where they don't appear in Washington, D.C., you now get them in the Golden Age. So you get a double narrative, because you always wonder, what did Madame Bovary really do that day when she went to the chemist in Rouen? And did she stop off at the place where she was going to buy a hat? And could she have had a conversation with a certain person that might have been very revelatory? Now, these are the alternatives to what you make decisions when you write a novel or write anything. What to tell, what not to tell. So I'm deciding to tell more things, to show more about the people, as well as put under the bright lights the great historical figures, so that you really get to know Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins, and you watch them govern the world by the end. So that's the progression there, and it's like making movies. It's reverse angle shots.
I'm going to go back to Burr and then move forward. One thing you said, that democracy was not intended, or someone says that. Burr looked dreamily into the ashy grave. None of us, not even Jefferson, foresaw this democracy. I suspect it will be a bad thing. If it was not intended, what was?
A republic was intended. And a republic is simply an organization. It was modeled more or less on the Roman Republic, pre-Caesar. One thing we did not want was a dictator, and so we promptly got one in 1861 with Lincoln. And we've had several since. But by and large, we didn't want the dictatorship of one person. We didn't want monarchy. And we did not want democracy. People were terrified of that. So the Senate was founded in order. The House of Representatives was to be the one that represented the people, like the House of Commons in England. And all the crazies could get there and pass all the legislation on earth. But the Senate had to okay it. And that it was really, I think it was George Washington describing the role of the Senate. At first nobody knew what it was there for. He said, well, it's like the saucer that you pour your tea into to cool it. And he said, we need a time to cool after the heat of the House of Representatives. The Supreme Court is now totally out of control, but thanks to Marbury versus Madison. Chief Justice John Marshall gave the court the right of judicial review of acts of Congress, which is totally unconstitutional. It's nowhere in the Constitution. But he put that in a decision which they didn't act upon for 20, 30 years, by which time it had solidified, and the court suddenly finds itself a major player able to strike down acts of Congress, which would have been regarded by the founders as heresy, blasphemy, because all authority is not in the Supreme Court. All authority was with we the people. We the people is the general rubric by which our government is formed. However, some people are more equal than others. It did not mean that everybody had equal rights. At the beginning, you had to have so much property. You had to be a free man, white man. And you had to have a certain amount of property before you could vote for House of Representatives. In turn, they chose the Senate. Well, the state legislatures chose the Senate. And the presidency was chosen by an electoral college, which we've just been through that. Anything to complicate it, anything to slow it down, anything to keep the people from ruling. So that's what Burr is talking about. We don't want majority rule because the majority does stupid things. And yet we don't want a dictator, even no matter how wise, we don't want him to tell us how to do things. Nor would we trust a Senate, with 50, 100, whatever members, to have sufficient wisdom to govern for us. Hence the checks and balances. The House can go crazy over here. The Senate says, okay, cool it over there. The court, after Marbury versus Madison, says, well, we don't think that conforms with the Fourth Amendment.